What if every vote you cast is actually a permission slip for your own subjugation? What if the system we've put on a pedestal, asked greatest political achievement of mankind achievement, is just tyranny with better advertising? This is a moment that broke all illusions. When millions of people in the US watched as something broke after the 2016 election results, people who had trusted for decades democratic processes suddenly found wondering if normal people could handle political power. It was very hard to deal with the cognitive dissonance. But this crisis of faith is revealing wasn't new more than 2,400 years ago. Plato saw his teacher Socrates was put to death by a mob of people who voted and got to Allegory. Conclusion: democracy doesn't take, frees people from tyranny, make tyranny feel like freedom. Plato's ideas have been proven right by modern psychology. Scary ways to warn. Solomon Ash's conformity tests from the 1950 showed that 75% of people will give up clear proof from their own senses. Don't disagree with a group. If we can't trust ourselves to figure out which the line is longer, when the answer is clear, how can we trust millions of strangers to pick our leaders wisely? But this is what should really bother you. Researchers at Emory University in 2006 did brain scans on voters who were partisan while they thought about what they had learned. Candidates they like best when faced with clear proof of their candidates' contradictions or failures in the brain areas linked with reasoning. There was no increased activity, while circuits for emotion lit up. The people weren't just ignoring facts that their brains were giving them something good to do. For avoiding your brain is in a state of cognitive dissonance, made to love democracy in every way. Manipulation. That's exactly how the system keeps control. To learn why democracy today works as a polite dictatorship, we must first admit what it gets right. Democracy makes a promise. Feeling is psychologically impossible to resist. That you are important and your voice matters. That social problems that are hard to solve can bear through the wisdom of many. People's secret police are worse than open tyranny. Brutal repression of censorship in a democracy systems really do make things better in but human dignity and freedom of choice. This is what Plato knew that we've forgotten. The best way to control those seem like control at all democratic systems have gotten better at something that authoritarian governments could never get a lot of people to take part in. Our being in charge of your own subjugation through the process. Think about how this works in the mind. Dictatorships that are traditional macro resistance through clear oppression. People know they are being controlled and create secret networks below ground codes. Revolutionary movements, but democratic systems channel dissent into elections, protests, and other allowed outlets. Petitions that give psychological relief without threatening real power structures is what makes this so smart. In terms of psychologist Ivan Levitsky, a political scientist, calls authoritarianism competitive. You feel like you're going against the system when you vote against people who are already in office, but you're really making the very framework that limits your options. Plato saw the heaviest punishment Asto refused to rule is to be ruled by Simono, who is less than U-bot democratic systems. Make sure you never know how bad your real rulers are, because your brain chose them. Wants freedom and the ability to make decisions. Democracy gives people the feeling of power, illusion of both, while making sure that all meaningful choices serve the Sami theorists that are hidden. The house always wins, but you keep betting because every bet feels like you. This is Plato's most important insight, was understanding what democratic freedom is. Makes its own end in the he drew a clear map of the republic's seconds democracy makes. People think too much of something that makes people want it, making things easier for demagogish leads to tyranny in the form of modern neuroscience. Will be popular tells us why this progression is almost inevitable when you have too much information over the prefrontal cortex of your brain in charge of critical thinking becomes too much and shuts down the limbic system takes over and makes decisions made on feelings and gut feelings instead of analysis. Psychologists call this too many choices. Too many choices stop good making decisions and making people hungry for confident leaders who say they will handle everything. About Venezuela's path shows this perfectly. Hugo Chavez didn't take power by force of arms. He won 56% of the vote in 1998 by promising help for Venezuela's too much political complexity. People weren't choosing tyranny. They were picking psychological comfort. By the time they figured out what had happened, much they cared about Shave's murder, it almost impossible to admit a mistake. This same thing is happening all over the world right now, in country after voters in the country are picking leaders who promise to make their minds easier to understand, hard to think for them, choose for them, take responsibility for things they don't want to deal with this anymore. Shows what is wrong with democracy. Rewards leaders who are good at winning elections but not running the country in a way. These are all the same, different skills that often clash directly. The mental traits that make someone attractive to voters' confidence, simplicity, and emotion resonance are exactly the opposite of good governance, need shumble, complexity, thinking. Analytically, Plato wrote about this in his Ship of Fools. Metaphor: imagine a ship where passengers can vote on decisions about navigation. The skilled navigator knows how the wind blows, currents, and navigating by the stars, but sounds unsure when explaining complicated labels at sea. Meanwhile, charming passengers make promise smooth sailing and nice weather, confidently ignoring the navigator's warnings as elitist fear-mongering. Woe do you think the passengers pick? And what happens to the boat? Plato's answer: philosopher kings picked for their wisdom, not their popularities and snobby. Until you think about how we handle knowledge in every other area, we don't vote on how to do surgery, scientific or engineering specifications. We trust people who have spent years getting good at difficult knowledge, but not in politics. Bones a problem for real experts who tend to say, you don't know what you mean complicated, and admit that you don't know things that aren't part of their area of expertise. It makes what psychologists call we don't like things that are unclear, not comfortable with not knowing, and prefer answers that are sure, even when they are wrong. About the 2008 financial crisis shows this dynamic perfectly. Economists who knew a lot about housing bubbles had been warning about debt levels that can't be kept up for years, but they sounded like they were in school and unsure. People who don't have any money, on the other hand, experts promised with confidence that housing prices would always go up, that the market rewarded trust over competence, until reality got in the way. Catastrophically isn't just about one person. It's about how democratic psychology is. Institutions choose in a planned way against expertise. Think about the kind of Samayan who is willing to spend years campaigning to get money and make promises they know they can't keep. Activities need certain personality type traits: narcissism, comfort with tolerance for manipulation, and cognitive dissonance that don't always go together with real wisdom or skill. Look around at the leaders of your country right now. Are these the smartest and most capable people you know, or are they the most ambitious, most persuasive, and most willing to say what you want to hear? Plato's philosopher kings weren't meant to be good leaders, but rather people knew how heavy power was instead of wanting it like Marcus. Debates about democratic governance elections take up a lot of mental energy, while having little effect on real power. The people feel very involved with political processes that are mostly theatrical, while real power works through channels they hardly know about this arrangement within the institution. Cerveza, lot of psychological functions, it gives the emotional satisfaction or political involvement while making sure that taking part doesn't put at risk established power structures. It makes ways to express dissent and frustration while using that energy into patterns that have already been set for most importantly. It makes people feel in charge of results they don't actually control when democratic events make things that people don't like. People blame themselves for making the choice, not asking if they were doing it wrong. They ever had real choices when policies don't work. The usual response is to ask for more democracy, more transparency in participation, compete in elections, instead of looking into whether democratic systems are able to make things structurally to results. This is the smart thing to do system. It makes you a part of your own powerlessness while making you are in charge of or agreeing. With Plato's criticism, we should all agree that it is limits and think about democratic. Strongest arguments against the theory Joseph Schumpeter's theory of competition of democracy. For example, doesn't say that voters make smart choices about policy, but instead of competition in elections, leaders' reasons to serve public interests, like how the market competition is good for customers, without making them learn how to make things steps. Theory has some merit in a democratic way. Do make ways for changes in leadership, on power within institutions and feedback loops between those in power and those who are not even. When democratic processes aren't perfect, they can stop the worst kinds of tyranny by making it hard for any one person, tolerant or group to make permanent control. And also, examples from the past exist of democratic systems that fight back demagogy and making things complicated for a long time. Marshall Plan, for example, is a American voters to back costly programs for international aid with benefits that aren't clear. Right away, environmental rules often get through Vevant, though it costs money in the short term. Sometimes democratic processes do work. Put competent leaders at the top, who put governance over being liked, but these counterexamples don't disprove Plato's main point about democratic psychology. They just show that the fall from democracy to tyranny doesn't have to happen, not certain. Mental weaknesses Plato identified remain real and constant threats to democracy also. The real-world problems with there are other options for philosopher kings. A lot of how would really wise how to find and choose leader stops philosopher kings from becoming corrupted by power or cut off from the how. Do we make sure that the people they govern are claims to wisdom aren't just advanced forms of self-interest? Plato himself seemed to know these things. Hard to show his ideal state, more like a thought experiment for understanding the psychology of politics. Tanner's a useful plan for change music. What do we do with this awkward thing? Information, how do we live in a real way? Within systems we know as Plato's ideas are fundamentally manipulative. The answer wasn't to give up on politics and but to deal with it. Incorrect understanding in the Cavethi philosopher who gets away is an allegoria. Moral duty to go back and try education, even though most people know will turn down uncomfortable truths. This means taking part in democratic process, like a participant who is aware of it, instead of a victim who doesn't know it, instead of hoping that democracy will be something It's not a way to turn popular wisdom into good government. Turning knowledge into good government, we can thank it for what it really is. A way to deal with people's mental health needs, while keeping relative social being aware of stability. Doesn't fix the main problems with democraticuit. It does change how you govern relationship to getting involved in politics. One, you know how your brain works, controlled by leaders who are sure of themselves. To emotion and tribal identity, you can get better at dealing with these effects when you realize that your political people's opinions are more influenced by more emotional needs than rationally. You can become more humble through analysis about how sure you are, and more curious about points of view that make you think. You know how democratic institutions channel dissent into harmless places to think more strategically about where to put your energy. But most importantly, consciousness lets you take part in politics without being mentally affected by them. You can vote for them if they own you, and get involved while staying critical, far away from the myths that make these things seem more important than they really are. This isn't about becoming cynical or pulling away from it. It's about getting more involved in civic life, smartly, with full knowledge of the psychological processes at work. Plato thought that political systems show the psychological traits of their people. If he was right, then the kind of democracy we get is the kind we note because of our good qualities, but because of how limited our brains are and needs for emotional support. We want to know what's going on without having to do the hard work of learning that we want to be independent with, taking on the responsibility that comes with real freedom. We want easy answers to hard questions, leaders who are sure of themselves in times of doubt, and someone to blame when things go wrong. Democratic systems give you that is exactly how the feeling of politics comfort without its substance, the agency of making decisions together without individual responsibility, the satisfaction of feeling morally better without the weight of moral consistency. But getting this dynamic is the first step to getting over it. When you stop thinking that democracy is anything it isn't, you can start interacting with it in a more planned way, and not as you can find psychological weaknesses, less open to being manipulated. As you read this right now, the same psychological processes that destroy the institutions of democracy in Germany, Venezuela, and a lot of other countries are doing business in your country. The personalized war of information that makes neighbors into enemies is aiming your social media feeds. Too many choices that make people want authoritarian simplicity is too much to handle. Your brain power every day. The demagogues are already here with us, promising to make things easier, and freedom needs uncertainty. They're getting support not because people are bad, but that's not whited out from the mental strain of burden of taking part in democracy of the choices they have to make not qualified to make tired by the duty of self-relief. Question isn't if modern democracy works as a polite Plato's analysis makes that a dictatorship. Question is if you will take part with full awareness of the psychologicalness of the mental mechanisms in action, or still in action doing things while sleepwalking through citizenship, while real power works out of your mind. This choice isn't between being cynical and idealism, it's about awareness. For Susanat, being aware. Plato saw this decision coming. He saw it happen thousands of years ago in ancient Athens, thought it would happen again throughout history, and his ideas fit perfectly with our modern situation. Only thing that is different is that our more democratic illusions are less sophisticated, our mental more subtle manipulation, and our need for more uncomfortable self-awareness. Your brain wants you to do it more than ever. Don't read this message because it threatens beliefs about the system you live in that make you feel safe. Live in that response. That's what Plato was talking about the choice to think beyond threat reaction. That's the first step toward real freedom. Is democracy that isn't looked at as not worth saving, and though the citizen who doesn't think is not really free. The most dangerous kind of tyranny is the one that feels free, and your mind is wired to love it. Question your assumptions, look for truths that make them uncomfortable. There are more shadows on the wall, more beautiful than real life, but only real life can set you free. The cave is a nice place to be. The light is harsh, but the choice toast up toward the light. That choice is still yours for now. In his meditations, Aurelius wrote about he avoids a lot of trouble if he doesn't look to find out what his neighbor says or does to be a good leader. You need to focus on issues instead of popularities. Instead of popularity, systems almost always donut possible. The cave allegory by Plato isn't just it's a technical, philosophical metaphor, a guide to understanding how modern information systems shape democracy consciousness. We're all tied to our devices, watching carefully curated shadows that algorithms choose, target the most people involved and the least it hurts. But here's what makes modern democratic control more advanced than anything Plato thought, that the shadows were made just for the mere news sources on social media. And suggested content is tailored to strengthen what you already believe, while making it seem like you have a choice here, not just seeing the same thing. Shadows like everyone else. You're watching shadows made just for your Cambridge psychological profile. The Analytica scandal showed something even more troubling, using psychological profiles made from Facebook information. Political operatives could aim at people with personalized message made to take advantage of their specific weakness in the mind. People who were anxious got fear-based content. Narcissistic people got stuff that made them feel special, and depressed people who got information material that backed up their bad world. This wasn't normal propaganda aimed at for everyone. It was unique psychological warfare aimed at you. Specificalicious makes what psychologists call confirmation bias on steroids. To get people to believe in traditional propaganda, you had to force them to do it. Everyone to see the same things. People can do things in modern democratic systems to pick their own personalized reality while feeling like they know more than ever. The outcome is unprecedented political polarization mixed with complete buying. Sure, you're on the right side during important political events. People taking in different streams of information aren't just disagreeing on police say really going through different things. Realities, they're seeing different things. Different experts have different ideas, moral frameworks for making sense of some things happening. Both sides feel like they know everything and morally better, while buying forces that systematically change things. They don't see this is happening to you right now. As you watch this, and the algorithms are learning, your political operatives preference writing messages humans for your demographic, and your data to the environment is being changed in a quiet way, to change the way you think and act in ways you don't even know about. This is why checking facts doesn't work, and why political debates seem more and more futile when people come across information that goes against their own reality, that they don't change their minds. They go through with backfire effect, as psychologists call. I tend become more sure of their. Plato thought this would happen in the original position. Exactly. Dynamici think he is their worst enemy, chotels them the truth. In a democratic win societies where people tell the truth, they aren't silenced. They're pushed to the edges by censorship, through algorithmic suppression, and rejected by others. The system doesn't need to stop dissent. It just needs to make a decent, makes people feel socially awkward and a lot of money for the minder. Weimar Republic might be the best place to get clearest example of how democratic psychology makes tyrannical outcomes possible. Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s was a working democracy with strong civil rights and free elections and active political debate. But when political and economic crisis and instability made it hard to think clearly, German voters didn't fight back, they welcomed authoritarianism. Hitler's rise shows something important about how weak democracies are. People don't choose tyranny because they love to be oppressed, they pick it because freedom becomes a mental state too much to Berwin. The prefrontal cortex gets overwhelmed by how complicated it is, and uncertainty. Your limbic system takes control and wants simple emotional answers. The Nazi Party's election success didn't come from appealing to people's worst instincts, but giving relief from the tiring weight of making a democratic choice. Hitler said he would take care of everything. Foreign policy, in economics issues and societies, so that regular Germans wouldn't have to worry any more about things they thought they weren't qualified to. This pattern keeps coming back, history, because it takes advantage of basic more about how people think and feel than political situations that only last a short time. Socrates was not put to death in ancient Athens because the people of Athens were especially cruel, but they had to answer his questions, face their own lack of knowledge. Some of the systems work in a planned waste-off. Same goes for the Roman Republic. Change into an empire came next. Plato's predicted order. Rome leaders found out that they could get more power by going straight to than popular assembly, showing that you are capable through old-fashioned institutions. Politicians like Julius Caesar thought out that giving away bread and circuses was better than proving ability to run things. The mental appeal was the same as modern populism. Hard problems with easy answers, clear enemies to blame, and charming leaders who say they will fight for the people against corrupt elites. The truth that these leaders were themselves elite insiders didn't matter. What mattered waste emotional satisfaction of feeling represented and given power. Take a look at how many people there are in the world today. Democracies are going through right now this same dynamic. Many groups are choosing strong decide for them, men who promise to think for them to take charge of complicated. They don't want to deal with any Morion of Plato's most talked about ideas. The noble lie was one of the ideas that good governance might need certain myths that everyone believes in to keep society together. Mythos is often used as proof by critics or proto-fascist ideas, but they miss something important. For every political system is based on basic myths about legitimacy, progress, and purpose. Difference between Plato's good lushes and the myths of democracy, area awareness, and purpose. Plato wanted myths that ruled to be carefully made by smart leaders, one who what they were supposed to do, and limits decric systems make up stories spontaneously through the mess of media, stories that are in conflict with each other, and mass psychology, with no one being responsible for its accuracy or responsibility for how accurate they are, or think about some basic consequences. Democratic myths that every citizen's, no matter what, your opinion should be given equal weight. Of knowledge or skill that is hard to get. There are ways to fix social problems through election process. That the rule of the majority makes sensory results that leaders in politics apprint the real interests of their constituents instead of their own mental needs. These myths aren't always truthfuls, but they're not easy to understand. They really do work to make it possible for people to participate in democracy, feel meaningful and morally right, instead than to to talk about how political systems actually fix the psychological problem. The problem with democratic mythology is that it stops honest interaction with instead of political reality accepting the trade-offs that must be mad conflicts and limits of any democratic cultures in the governing system promise. Things that can't happen, freedom to choose without having to take responsibility without any consequences, representation without the influence of elites. 1. Reality always falls short of these promises. Democratic systems make what psychologists call cognitive dissonance is the uncomfortables between what you believe and what you've seen instead of changing. Unrealistic weight. People usually blame their expectations on certain leaders, parties, or groups while keeping faith in the system itself. This makes a never-ending cycle of disappointment and blame. That makes democratic societies more and more unstable and easy for demagogues to take advantage of. Woe. Promise to finally make the story Strunden's democracy as a polite not only does dictatorship need to be looked at manipulation of the mind but design of institutions. It looks like democratic systems spread power in a broad way while in reality putting it in places where it is less visible. Think about how modern democracies work, how governments really work. Elected officials are very visible additions about issues that aren't that big while important policy areas, money regulatory frameworks for policy ideals between countries are handled by technical experts who work for the government but aren't elected, and international groups mostly protected from democratic pressure. For example, in the European Union, the European Commission is not elected, starts laws and makes sure they are followed. Compliance among all member states will the European Parliament that people vote for directly has a lot less power than most people think. National leaders run for office on domestic issues, problems, but once they are in charge, they often can't follow supranational rulers, which voters are given the illusion of faffic systems where the most decisions that have an effect are Medell Sweathers makes what political scientists call the democratic deficit. Call the lack of democracy. People make important decisions who don't have to answer to voters, while theoretically elected officials who accountable have little power over results that really matter to people's lives, while the visible parts of